A missile was launched a little while ago from North Korea. I will only tell you that we will take care of it. We have General Mattis in the room with us, and we've had a long discussion on it. It is a situation that we will handle.
Welcome back to The World Over. That was the president discussing North Korea's latest missile test. As tensions between the United States and North Korea continue to escalate, how does the U.S. deal with Pyongyang? And what role does China play in all of this? Joining us from Florida to discuss is president of the Population Research Institute and author of the new book, Bully of Asia. Please welcome Stephen Mosher back to the program. Thanks for being here, Steve. I want to start with this North Korean missile. We have, the United States, 1,500 nuclear warheads. North Korea has about 100. Is this really a threat? Is it as big as we're hearing or being led to believe?
Well, the fact that Kim Jong-un is resisting international pressure from the United States, from the UN, from many countries to stop his missile production program and stop firing missiles over Japan, by the way. Not this one, but the previous one went right over the sovereign territory, the sovereign country of Japan. Yeah, I think he's a danger. He's a loose cannon, as it were. But the solution to North Korea lies in China. It really doesn't lie in Pyongyang. People need to understand that North Korea is China. It is defended by China under a mutual defense treaty. It survives because of China's aid and support. China buys North Korean coal, and it ships back into North Korea gas and crude oil to keep the North Korean economy humming. China components go into making North Korean nuclear weapons and North Korean missiles. Kim Jong-un, little rocket man as we call him now, wouldn't have nuclear weapons or wouldn't have missiles were it not for parts and pieces that are made in China and assembled in North Korea.
Okay, I want to share with you a tweet the president sent out on Wednesday, President Trump. He said he'd spoken to President Xi of China, and he said this: just spoke to President Xi Jinping of China concerning the provocative actions of North Korea. Additional major sanctions will be imposed on North Korea today. This situation will be handled. Okay, you spoke a moment ago, and I've read the book, which is fantastic, by the way, and it talks about the trade relationship between China and North Korea, how, you know, this is really their biggest and only foreign trading partner is China. How much control do the Chinese have over Kim Jong-un?
Well, Kim Jong-un is the latest in the line of the Kim dynasty, and China has always regarded North Korea as being as close as lips and teeth, North Korea and China. North Korea are the lips, China is the teeth. And what that means is that North Korea is a buffer state, protecting China from the 29,000 American troops in South Korea, protecting China from the example of ordered liberty that you see in the free, democratic South Korea. So Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao Zedong, the first emperor of the Red Dynasty that rules China today, once said, if the lips are gone, the teeth will get cold. And what he meant by that is if North Korea falls, China will be exposed to democracy, will be exposed to an American president. So that's why they're keeping North Korea alive. That's why 90% of the trade that North Korea does with the rest of the world goes through China or is with China. If China wanted to, it could turn out the lights in North Korea virtually overnight. North Korea would get cold and dark. And as I say, these missiles and nuclear weapons wouldn't exist except that China is providing the parts and pieces. These missiles should say, assembled in North Korea using Chinese components.
Well, we keep hearing, though, from the president and others, that China is willing to exert influence over North Korea. We keep hearing that the Chinese are attempting to exert some influence. Are we being played? Is the United States being played here by the Chinese communists?
We've been being played for a long, long time, going on a quarter century now. We were played back in the late 90s when China said to President Clinton, if you simply provide North Korea with billions of dollars in aid, they will stop their nuclear weapons program and their missile program. So we gave North Korea $4 billion. That's a pretty good chunk of money. And of course, Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, continued to build missiles and nuclear weapons. They played the same game again in 2008 with President Bush, saying Kim will stop his programs if you simply give him foreign aid. So we gave him hundreds of millions of dollars before we realized that we'd been had a second time. We shouldn't fall for this a third time.
Oh, and what's the end game here for North Korea? What do you think? I mean, he's sending these missiles up every week. There's international pressure on him, sanctions being imposed that don't seem to be working. 90% of their trade has been cut off, and he's still, sending up the missiles and building them. What's the end game?
Well, I would advise President Trump to disarm North Korea, sanction China. Now, we've started doing that a little bit. We closed down one little bank near the North Korean border that handled North Korean transactions. We've sanctioned 4 companies that were providing electrical circuits and other sensors to go into the missiles that Kim is building. But we need to go further than that. We need to impose serious sanctions on China, because when China begins to feel the pain, Kim Jong-un will no longer be in power. He will join the Kim dynasty, his father and grandfather in the Kim dynasty tomb outside of Pyongyang very quickly. U.S.
Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, told the United Nations Security Council that North Korea's missile launch brings us closer to war. And then she called on China to do its part, once again, relying on China, to rein in North Korea. Listen to this from Wednesday.
We know the main driver of its nuclear production is oil. Through sanctions, we have cut off 90% of North Korean trade and 30% of its oil. But the crude oil remains. The major supplier of that oil is China. President Trump called Chinese President Xi this morning and told him that we have come to the point that China must cut off the oil from North Korea.
Why do we keep taking advice, do you think, counsel from the Chinese on this situation if, as you suggest in your book, Believe Asia, China is North Korea?
Well, I think we're being naive. Certainly the Chinese leadership, President Xi Jinping on down, think of us as naive and innocent and easily deceived. And I think they're deceiving us with the North Korean situation. They've armed North Korea. They've set North Korea up as the boogeyman. Meanwhile, they're making aggressive actions in the South China Sea.
Right.
They're
building
being
islands
aggressive towards India, towards Bhutan, in the East China Sea, building artificial islands. It's a pretty good thing when you can take a sandbar that's underwater at high tide, pour thousands of tons of concrete on it, and call it an island, and then claim everything to the horizon. If you can do that in the South China Sea, you can do that anywhere. It's an amazingly aggressive act. In normal times, it would be an act of war. Well, we're not paying attention, Raymond, because we're being distracted by this North Korean situation.
Yeah. There's also deep inroads that the Chinese have made into the United States. Now, you've been on the show before and we've talked about this, but talk to me for a moment about how the Chinese have bought their way into higher education, into the Ivy Leagues, and set up Chinese institutes all around China that are operated by places like Harvard and Yale and major universities.
China has set up about 1,000 what are called Confucius Institutes around the world. Several hundred of these are in the United States of America. Now, of course, they're called Confucius Institutes. They're not called, for example, Chairman Mao Zedong Institutes, because they wouldn't want to name the institute after one of the greatest mass murderers in human history, who's responsible for 65 million deaths in China alone. So they set up Confucius Institutes by going to a university like Stanford, like Harvard, and offering them millions of dollars in exchange for space on campus, in exchange for hiring a director who is sympathetic to working for China, and then teaching the Chinese version of history and culture to these naive, innocent American students who come to the center to learn about China. It's a major propaganda effort. It's not run by the Ministry of Education in China at all. It's run by the United Front Department of the Chinese Communist Party, as in Communist Front Organization. It's intended to propagandize American youth, and quite frankly, they shouldn't be allowed. We can't set up American institutes on the campus of Beijing University. They shouldn't be allowed to do the same to us.
Well, now there are a lot of satellite campuses, I notice, in China, in Shanghai, in Beijing, and these are American schools that now have satellite campuses there. That must come with tentacles attached too, Steve.
Well, it does. There are certain topics that are absolutely off limits in China. We call them the 3 T's. the topic of Taiwan, the topic of Tiananmen, and the topic of Tibet. You can't talk about Taiwan because it's free China, where 24 million Chinese, for the first time in Chinese history, have a successful free government. You can't talk about Tibet because Tibet wants to be free. China doesn't want to let it go. You can't talk about Tiananmen because that bloody massacre is a deep stain on the whole history of the People's Republic.
Let's talk about the dream. And President Xi has been very forthright about his vision for the immediate future of the hegemon, what you've called the hegemon, and the future of the People's Republic of China. What is that dream?
Well, the dream of Xi Jinping, the dream of the Chinese Communist leadership, is that China will regain its traditional place in the world, and that is to say, at its center. That's what Zhongguo, the two Chinese characters that make up the name China, mean. They mean the kingdom at the center of the earth. But there's another way that they refer to China, and that is as Tianxia, Tian being heaven and Xia meaning under. They refer to their own countries all under heaven. What we really have is an empire that survived into the modern age. China wants to reclaim the position of number one in the world, and there's only one country that stands in the way of that, and that's our own. That's why they dislike us. That's why they want us out of the way. That's why they want to secede us.
And what do you make of President Trump's overtures to them? He invited the President Xi, to Mar-a-Lago. They recently had a visit in China, very cordial. There was lots of dancing dragons and opera companies and great joy expressed.
Right.
What's the end game of all of that? I mean, does that advance the American position? He has been very tough on trade, we should say, behind the scenes, and in front of the cameras, very warm and welcoming.
Well, I think that's you're seeing what you're seeing there is the art of the deal in action. Because the first thing you do when you're trying to make a deal is you identify who the decision maker is on the other side of the table. You don't want to be negotiating with the number 2 or the number 3 guy. So Xi has been identified by President Trump as, quote, the king of China. He's actually more than the king of China. He's the new Red Emperor. But all roads lead to Xi. And so Xi is the key guy. And if you want to solve North Korea, you go to Xi. If you want to solve the trade problem, you go to Xi. And those were the issues that Trump brought up when he visited Xi in Beijing. And I think we saw some progress, at least on the trade issue, when Trump brought back $250 billion in orders from China. Now that in itself goes a long way towards righting the trade imbalance. And I think he'll keep the pressure on Xi Jinping to buy more of American goods and services, which is what we all want, which will cause American factories to open up again, American jobs to be created.
Were you surprised that we heard so little about China's checkered human rights record as well as its religious freedom record while the president was visiting Asia and China in particular?
Well, I would have liked to have heard more, Raymond, because crosses are being ripped off the top of churches. Catholics have been told they cannot take their children to Mass because it's illegal to teach your own children the faith. Home church leaders have been arrested and home church gatherings have been declared illegal. Homeschooling has been told, people have been told they cannot homeschool their kids. All kids are to be put in government schools from kindergarten through college. There they are to be educated to be little national narcissists, super nationalists, and to be disdain the United States of America.
Stephen Mosher, my final question, what would be your advice to the Trump administration, to American policymakers in their interaction with China? How should they interact with this regime? It is a survivor. It is a country that has invested in real estate in the United States, corporations in the United States. I was just reading about this Donald Tang, who founded something called Tang Media Partners that is gobbling up all kinds of theaters and producing entities in Hollywood, all of which you know are controlled by the Chinese government. How do you interact with a body like that that is so multifaceted? They're moving on multiple fronts.
Well, I think you realize have to realize that China is a threat to the current world order. China's dream is the world's nightmare. They want to replace us as the dominant power, but a world under China's control would be less free, it would be less democratic, human rights would be disrespected. It would be a world that would not only be bad for Americans, but for other Asian peoples and indeed for the Chinese people themselves. We have to recognize that China, not Islamic terrorism is a disease of the skin. It's irritating, it's painful, but it will not kill you. China, under Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, is a disease of the heart. It can be fatal if we're not paying attention. Fortunately, we now have an administration that seems to be paying attention at long last.
Bully of Asia, Why China's Dream is the New Threat to World Order by Stephen Mosher is available at bookstores everywhere and online. Stephen, thank you for being here.